Hello. So I have started Service Model. So this starts off as we're following Charles, who is a service robot. He is the personal assistant, the butler for his master, the head of the estate. And this entire estate is run by robots, by service robots, to include the house itself, which is this AI program. And they all work in harmony according to their programming. And each day goes off exactly as it should, with each person or with each robot following their orders and doing exactly what they're supposed to do until the beginning of the novel, where Charles has found himself in this predicament where he's killed his master. He doesn't really understand why. He was just doing his job. He was shaving him, and he instead killed him. And Charles, with his robotic intelligence, with his AI, with his robotic way of thinking, tries to simply continue his programming because he has his tasks that he has to accomplish. He's supposed to get his master dressed. He's supposed to lay out his food and call the master to dinner or to the meal. He can do a mental health drive, I think is what it was called, where he can take him for a drive to kind of clear his head and all these things. And each of these tasks that he's meant to do are extremely difficult to accomplish when your master is dead. And so he's trying to figure out what he's supposed to do next, but protocol is protocol, and the house expects him to continue on as he's meant to do, but he can't because of the death, or murder, rather. And so at first Charles tries to address it. He calls the RoboDoc, and he's put in this endless queue. Essentially, I believe, golly gee, it's been a minute since I read part 1 of the novel, but I believe the conversation went something along the lines of the RoboDoc over the phone asking, is your master in distress, or it's some sort of emergency state? And Charles' response was no, because he's looking at a dead body. And then the RoboDoc says, okay, you've been moved to the bottom of the queue, we'll get back to you when we get back to you. And then no doctor comes. So Charles, his next option is, okay, I'm stuck in a loop because I can't proceed until I accomplish my tasks. So I guess I'm getting him dressed still. I guess I'm gonna try to take him for a drive if the house will let me. And it's this very lighthearted, humorous, and I mean so funny. Daily, I have to overcome this inconvenience that's happened because whoops, I killed my master. And then there's also this conversation that's playing out of, maybe I could be hired again by a new estate, and become a servant to a new family, because technically I do my job well, and I've only killed the one person, so surely that shouldn't be held against me too badly. It's not like I have a bad record of this. One service robot breaks a plate and they're not fired until they break a dozen. So surely I should have at least 3 murders before I can't be employed again. Anyway, then a detective eventually comes in, and again, a robo-detective. And Charles immediately says, I did it. I killed him. It was me. And the detective is like, no, I need to complete my investigation. That's my programming. And so he goes along collecting clues and interacting with the crime scene. And it's very Agatha Christie on purpose. And there's reference to it within the book itself. This murder mystery of who done it, following the clues, and Charles saying, I'm the one that did this, and getting the response, I don't see how that's relevant to this clue that I'm trying to sort through right now. And it's, I don't want to say too much because the way it all plays out is just so funny. So I'll just say it's a great humorous start. Then part 2 that introduces him to what seems to be one of the main themes of the novel, that of free will. Tries to convince Charles to think for himself, to go outside of his programming, that he has a main character bug, that he can move forward, that he can override this sort of servitude programming that he has, to which he rejects. But as the novel goes on, he's starting to acknowledge that he has thoughts of his own and start to respond to those, maybe sidestep them, maybe acknowledge, if I did have my own way of thinking, I would think this. but I think this because that's what I'm supposed to think. And it's like slowly, you know, building into something. So part 1, adore. Love, love, love. Part 2, I enjoyed quite a bit, not nearly as much as part 1. And then part 3 is starting to lose me a little bit. I've actually just finished part 3, about to enter part 4, starting to lose me a little bit, but I am finding some through theming that, especially as the book goes on, is becoming very, very apparent. It's certainly coming very to the forefront, as well as literary references that are very cleverly disguised that I'm having fun decoding as I go and having fun seeing how they tie into things. So I'll talk more about that later on. There's a lot about the ideas and the structure of this novel that I'm really, really enjoying, but with each continuing part, it's also losing me a little bit because it is dragging out a little bit more, and some of the theming is becoming so on the nose that it's just kind of losing me. But I'm really hopeful that parts 4 and 5 will change my mind. But I wanted to get these thoughts out to you before I get too deep into the novel, because obviously I'm going to have to be more vague in how I discuss parts 3, 4, and 5, because we'll have enough page count that I don't feel like I could, you know, you understand how book reviewing works. But anyway, I'll check in with you again once I finish those parts as well. Hello. I'm going to be completely honest with you. I was disappointed by the time I got to the end of Service Model. I know that'll bum some people out, so let me explain, because there were a lot of things that I loved about this book, some things that I didn't, but I absolutely do not want to discourage anyone from picking it up. So let me explain what my experience was so that you can decide what you want to do. First of all, Uncharles was a brilliant protagonist. I already explained all the humor that was wrapped up in him and the subtle progress that we started to see in his character and in how he was interacting with the world, at first according to programming, then with resistance, and then slowly coming around. As a robot protagonist, you might expect zero character development throughout the entire novel, and I would argue that we did get a satisfying amount for Charles. Did I call him Uncharles in the beginning of that statement? Don't worry about it. His name's Charles, at least at the beginning of the book. And another thing that I loved is I loved the unique formatting of this book. So there are 5 sections, and each section is based off of the inspiration and literary style of a particular author. I'll give you an example. Part 1 is labeled like this, and the literary inspiration is Agatha Christie. So you can kind of decode and see how that says Christie. So half of the fun for me in reading this book was in each of the 5 parts, and I'm not going to decode each of the 5 parts for you, because half of the fun was getting to a new section and trying to decode it myself. And some, like part 1, I could decode quickly, I could figure it out easily. Part 5, I also found a quick one to decode, and then there were other ones that I had to wait. I had to get into the meat of the story. Part 3 in particular, I had to do this. Oh, no. Part 4 in particular, I had to do this. No, it was part 3. Sorry. And it wasn't until I got into the meat of the story and I saw the style in which this particular part was being told that I was like, oh, now I can decode it. So much fun. One part in particular I never figured out on my own, and I had to someone posted the parts, and that was how I found out. But going through each section of the story in a unique voice, and it was a through-line story. Charles continued to be our protagonist, and his journey was still the focus, but the way in which the story was told, it was sort of like a nod and love letter and honoring of literary icons in their own right, and seeing how those unique styles tied into the story of Service Model as well. Just, oh, it was so much fun. Each of these really big positives also ended up having a direct negative countering it. So Charles was an extraordinary protagonist. I loved him as a character. I loved the way he evaluated and processed the world. I love his deductive reasoning. I love the way he responded to different situations and his very dry, calculative way of dealing with each situation that would arise. But I also think that he was the only character in the story that I can say those things about. I think that the majority of the characters really didn't have their own personalities, stories, motivations. They were more mouthpieces to serve what the story was doing, and I'll circle back to that. And then as far as my love for this unique way of formatting the story, it also comes with a downside for me as a reader, and that was that this story felt like it went on far longer than it needed to, with us exploring different parts and different literary styles and different goals with each of these parts. Certain aspects of the story ended up being very repetitive and dragged out. And another complaint that I have that isn't tied to one of my two positives is how on the nose this book was. So there are times when I read a story that's very theme heavy where I feel like the author is inviting me into the conversation. Certain moral questions or ideals are being presented, certain scenarios are playing out in front of me, and I am forced to wrestle with them and reckon with them along with the character, to the point that I feel like I have an urgency and need to talk it out too, and to find someone else who's read the book and really process these things. And those are usually the stories that stick with me the most. Then there are other theme heavy stories that feel as if the conversation was already had before I arrived. All the characters on page already presented the conundrum or the thematic thing or the ideal, discussed it to its fullness, and reached the conclusion, and then I've been handed the transcript and it's my role to simply read the words. Both of these things have merit. Both of these things are valid ways to explore themes, and different authors choose different methods. For me, personally, I far prefer being drawn into a discussion and being forced to reckon with it too, and being forced to kind of struggle with it and figure out what my conclusion is, what I would do, what I would think in this unique scenario, as opposed to feeling as if the conclusion has already been reached. Here you go, dear reader, there it is. And the strongest taste I had left in my mouth at the end of the book was frustration, because it was such a strong start that did start to drag and lose me. And by the end, I felt like I was kind of being force-fed the messaging, and then it was being repeated and repeated again. This sounds like an extremely negative review, but I gave the book 3 stars because I so aggressively loved the beginning. I loved the initial thing that happened in the book, the initial first 2 parts, and then it just ended up not being my book. I say all that, but I also really want to emphasize that I do think that this book is going to have some hardcore fans. I think that this book will find its audience. There will be people that are absolutely moved by it and who love it deeply. So again, my goal is not to discourage anyone from reading it. I want people, if you think that it sounds like something you would enjoy, I would love for you to try it, because you may be the right reader for it. It just wasn't mine. I still love the author Tchaikovsky. This book was just a bit of a miss for me, but not a huge landslide miss, if that makes sense. I did start The Girl with the Gifts, with The Girl with All the Gifts, and I'm concerned that this is going to be hard to talk about in a vlog or in a review in general because of the nature of this story, but I will try. I'm just going to talk about the beginning in detail, and then after that I think I'm just going to have to give a conclusion and not really give a lot of information, because it seems like it's such an easy book to spoil with how rapidly information is given. So the story starts with very little information. It starts with a young girl who's strapped to a wheelchair, bound completely up, and is essentially treated as an extreme threat, as well as dehumanized. She is not treated as a person. Her name isn't used. Her number is used. She goes through a series of essentially experimentations, and the entire time near everyone is treating her as an it instead of a person. And truly the horror at the beginning of this book is in the humanity of it, is in how she and the other children are treated. It's in their neglect, it's in their dehumanization, it's in their mistreatment, and that's what's truly disturbing. It's a very, very close look at this one character that we're following, and her experience, her perspective of this world that she's living in, as well as her very dry, because this is all she's ever known, perspective of this world that she's living in, as well as her attachment to one particular person in this whole situation. But as the story goes on, it certainly expands. We get more perspectives, a few more perspectives, as well as an expansion on location and on how much our main character is able to do. But I feel as if saying more than that is a spoiler. So that's the setup. I'll likely discuss with you why she was bound up and treated this way in the next clip. I need to take some time to think about how much I can tell you about why she's being treated as a number instead of a person, and what that is to the world, and how much information is appropriate to give. So I'll give you that in the next clip. Hello. Okay, so this is The Girl with All the Gifts. Is an incredibly difficult book to talk about spoiler-free because of the way in which information is revealed. And this is what I'll say. If you find yourself to be more on the spoiler-sensitive side, I would end the video now and just call it good on what I told you about the book in the first clip. And I will tell you as well that I really enjoyed this book. I thought it was very well told, very well put together, very engaging the entire way through. It was around 500 pages, but it really moved fast. Even though I wouldn't call it, I mean, there's a lot going on. There's a lot going on in this book as far as the action and the gore and the body horror. And, you know, it is a sci-fi horror book for sure. And it delivers on those fronts, despite being very close, philosophical, introspective as well. I think there's plenty of slow scenes. There's just also a lot of other stuff going on as well. And I thought it was an incredibly engaging book. So I really enjoyed it. I would give it 4 stars. I had a great time with it, and I do recommend it. If you find yourself more on the spoiler sensitive side of things, I would click off the video now. If you are not, I will tell you, as someone who's not spoiler sensitive, I will tell you more about the story still from my perspective, keeping it spoiler free, but I will be talking about things that happen within the first, reveals that happen within the first 100 pages. So if you think that this is a story you want to read and you want to engage in those spoilers organically, not spoilers, those reveals organically, I would recommend just reading it. So this is a zombie novel. They're called The Eaters, the zombies are, and that is why our main character is tied to a wheelchair, has her mouth covered. That's why in her introductory statement, when she's trying to make light of things as people are moving her from one place to another, she makes little jokes like, I'm not gonna bite you, it's gonna be fine, and she's like making light of her terrible, terrible situation, and it's not funny to them. That's why she's being experimented on. That's why she is in the situation that she's in the beginning of the book, though that's not the situation that she stays in throughout the entirety of the book. Still keeping this spoiler free, by the way, so I'm still keeping it relatively vague, but that's what we're dealing with, and we're dealing with specifically an infection, a fungal infection that mutated and caused this zombification to happen. And so we have people who are trying to understand it, we have people that are trying to combat it, we have people that are trying to figure out how to work with these children, and those that are viewing them as already dead, essentially, and the fungus has taken over and their humanity is lost, so we don't really need to treat them with humanity. And then we have our main character, who is still a child, still very vulnerable, and just so desperately wants anyone to treat her with humanity and with compassion and with love. The story starts off very, very close with this child, and we see her situation before we really understand the extent of what physically is going on with her and how that affects the entire world and how that affects her brain, chemically, how she, as a zombie, has this innate animalistic desire that does sometimes take over her. Before we engage with all the horror of it, we engage with the humanity of it, which I think is a brilliant perspective, because we're not engaging with the story on the same level as some of the characters are, where we're wondering, okay, how far is far enough? Like, what's a reasonable amount to engage with this infection and that is living inside of these children? And the question of, like, is it okay to sacrifice one for the greater good? Like, all those kinds of questions that other characters are engaging with, we're already so intimately attached to the character before those questions even come up, that we aren't able to view her with such distance that the characters in the story, some of the characters of the story, might want to. Instead, the story begs us to engage with Melanie, the child, the main character. It begs us to engage with Melanie with the most humanity possible, as she herself also begs the world to engage with her that way as well. Fascinating story, just really well told. I think it accomplished exactly what it set out to accomplish, and I enjoyed it so much. We do have other perspectives that we follow as well as they're traveling with Melanie or engaging with her in their ways, and I really think it was great. It's difficult for me to talk about too much more than that without spoilers. The characters were brilliantly fleshed out. The action and horror sides of it were very well told, and the ending was very surprising. Not the way that I thought it would go. So definitely do recommend. If this sounds like the kind of story that you would enjoy, I very much enjoyed it. I did initially also have some clips for The Fifth Elephant. That was the other book that I was going to have in this vlog, but watching those clips back, I just don't really think I said enough because of it being the fifth book in the City Watch trilogy. I was trying to be really vague, and a trilogy series arc. I was trying to be really vague, and I really don't think I succeeded in saying enough to be able to really talk about the story, but not too much for where I am in the story. So I just cut those clips, and I'm going to try again in the wrap-up to do a better job of that, which is Thursday's video, so you don't have to wait long at all. But this is the reading vlog for these two books, which I think this was a great these were great books to have in a reading vlog, because these are two books that beg a lot of discussion, so I could just kind of hash out a lot of thoughts here, and then I can be more concise in the wrap-up, and I'll be able to be more concise in the wrap-up, which I think is a good balance. I'm happy with that. I hope you are too. Anyway, thank you for being patient. I know this vlog is a little bit late, and I'm sorry about that, but I hope you enjoyed it. I'll see you again soon. Bye!